There was a road that the maps had forgotten, a thin thread of gravel and moss winding between trees that grew too close and whispered too often. It curved like a question no one had asked in years, leading nowhere in particular, and yet it never ended. Few remembered it. Fewer still took it. But for those who did, the path did not merely carry them. It changed them, imperceptibly, as if memory and belief dissolved into the rustling canopy overhead. At the far end of that road, where the forest grew older than stone and silence pressed heavy on every breath, stood a church no longer held by time. The wood had grayed like bone, the windows clouded by generations of dust, and the steeple leaned ever so slightly, not from gravity, but from something more tired than collapse. The bell tower stood intact, too intact. It rose like a finger pointing to something no one could see anymore, framed against a sky that refused to be either day or night. No bird circled it, no wind touched it. Yet every so often, at the stroke of no particular hour, those who wandered too close would swear they heard a bell toll, distant and gentle, like a sound remembered more than heard, and it only came to those who never believed, not in ghosts, nor gods, nor anything unprovable. They were the ones who heard it clearest. The townsfolk didn't speak of it, not out of fear, but forgetfulness. The church had become like an ache too old to diagnose, a relic of grief that no longer hurt, just lingered. Its presence was tolerated like fog, inevitable and without direction. Children, on dares, would sometimes walk the first 100 feet of the path before running back laughing. Adults, when pressed, would mention it with the vague discomfort of recalling a name they once loved but could no longer place. But there was always one person, at a time they couldn't explain, drawn not by faith, but by something quieter. Something like an itch behind the ribs or a word stuck at the back of the throat. They would wake one day and know they had to walk the path, not out of choice, nor fear, nor hope, just necessity. And when they did, the forest made room for them, not by moving, but by accepting. The light would change, the air would forget to move, and the church would wait, the way a story waits for someone willing to believe in it by accident. There was no sign, no welcome, no barrier, just the hush of old trees and a building that had not been entered in a generation, yet showed no sign of decay inside, as if the rot had been kept outside by something unspoken, something sacred, or simply stubborn. He had not planned to find the church. He had only meant to walk, to get away from the sound of fluorescent lights and the invisible hum of devices that knew more about him than he did. There had been a restlessness building for weeks, one he couldn't name, a sort of friction between the world and his skin. One morning, without packing or warning, he left. No message, no destination, just a step into elsewhere. The forest met him with neither hostility nor welcome. It didn't greet him. It simply allowed him to pass, like someone who had already been forgotten long before arrival. Each step seemed quieter than the last, not because the world grew still, but because he was beginning to forget what noise had ever been. Leaves whispered like thoughts not quite formed. The air didn't carry scent, only the memory of it. Earth before rain. Bark older than memory. Stone with names worn off. He didn't look at his watch. He didn't check his phone. He didn't notice when the path stopped being a path and started being a feeling underfoot. The church appeared as if he'd walked into a painting, left unfinished. It was there, and not. The edges didn't blur. They resisted being stared at too long. The more he looked, the more uncertain it became whether the building was collapsing, or being rebuilt from some other layer of time. The bell tower rose into view like a breath held too long, and though no wind stirred, the smallest shiver moved down his spine as he saw it. Not fear, not awe, recognition. There was no door, only an open frame where one should have been. No glass in the windows, just apertures into something quieter than outside. He stepped through, not as if entering, but as if continuing something he had forgotten starting. The floor didn't creak. The walls didn't speak, but they listened. Every surface carried the weight of memory that didn't belong to him, and yet treated him like a returning part of it. The pews were intact but covered in a fine layer of time. Not dust, not decay, but something that settled in places where belief had once gathered and then gone. A narrow aisle led toward what used to be an altar, now empty. Not erased, emptied, deliberately, like a gesture made and then withdrawn, leaving the shape of intention behind. Above, the ceiling opened into the hollow of the bell tower. There, unseen, hung the bell. He couldn't see it. He didn't need to. He felt its presence the way one feels a word about to be spoken. And in that instant he understood something he would never be able to explain. The bell did not ring to mark time. It rang when something unspoken reached its end. He sat in the second pew, not knowing why it felt right. The wood was cold, but not unkind. It carried the weight of many who had sat there before, though none had done so recently. There were no footprints, no candle wax, no signs of use. And yet, the place felt occupied in a way no crowd could replicate. Not by ghosts, not by spirits, but by something older than belief, the echo of attention, the kind that settles when people once gathered not to speak, but to feel the same silence. He didn't close his eyes. There was no need. The stillness wrapped around him like a shawl left behind by someone who never returned, but always intended to. The kind of warmth that lingers after grief has dried. He felt his shoulders drop, not from relief, but from recognition, like finding a room you didn't know you had lost. He had come with no question, yet answers began to form anyway, in the shape of memories that were not his own. Somewhere above, the bell remained quiet. But the silence it held was not empty. It was shaped, purposeful, like a breath drawn in but never exhaled. And he began to wonder, not with his mind, but with something softer, why the bell only rang for those who had never believed. Perhaps because belief carried too much expectation, or perhaps because disbelief made room for wonder. For those who had never prayed, the sound of the bell was not confirmation. It was invitation. Outside, the trees did not move. No birds sang. No light filtered in from above. The shadows cast by the tall windows did not shift with time. They merely observed. He wondered how long he had been sitting there, but time had unfastened its grip the moment he stepped onto the path. He could not remember his name, or why he had ever needed one. The silence was not pressing him to stay, nor asking him to leave. It simply was, complete, unyielding. He looked toward the altar again, not out of habit, but out of gravity, as if something from that direction was slowly pulling the center of him forward. There was nothing there, only an empty platform, and the faint outline of something that may have once been sacred, not in the religious sense, but in the quiet sense. A space kept clear because someone had loved it once. And then it happened. Not a sound, not a light, not a voice, but a weightless pressure behind the breastbone. The kind you feel when standing at the edge of a memory just before it breaks open. A suggestion, a beckoning, not to act, but to remain, to listen. Not for words, but for what remains when words have failed. And he realized the bell was listening too. He rose from the pew without realizing he'd moved. His footsteps made no sound on the wooden floor, as if the church had chosen to muffle every trace of him, keeping the moment whole. He approached the altar not with purpose, but with inevitability. There was nothing to see, and yet he stared at it as if reading a story written in absence. The surface was bare, but there were the faintest impressions. Small marks in the wood that spoke of hands once folded, of elbows leaned in sorrow or resolve, of something that had once mattered enough to be touched. Behind the altar, a narrow staircase led upward into the tower. It was not hidden, nor obvious. It existed the way old secrets do, not buried, but waiting. He stepped toward it as one might approach the edge of a page, ready to turn it without knowing what lay ahead. The steps creaked slightly, not as complaint, but as acknowledgement. Each footfall seemed to weigh more than the one before, not from exhaustion, but from meaning accumulating. The climb was short, but endless in sensation. The air grew cooler, not from wind, but from memory. The walls narrowed around him, not physically, but perceptually, as if he were being drawn deeper into a thought not his own. At the top, the chamber opened into a hexagonal space that had no windows, yet felt exposed to everything. The bell hung above, shrouded in shadow, too high to see clearly, too present to ignore. It didn't move. But it existed like a breath held between grief and clarity. There was no rope, no mechanism, just potential. He stood beneath it, unsure if he was meant to ring it or simply be near it, and the moment stretched, not with tension, but with intimacy, as if the bell, in its long silence, had been waiting not for a sound, but for a listener. He did not raise his hands, he did not close his eyes, he simply stood there and allowed the stillness to envelop him, not to erase him, but to reveal something that had been too quiet to notice before, a shape of longing, a weight of release, and for a moment, just one, he felt as if everything that had ever gone unanswered in him was no longer a question, but a sound, not yet made. Something shifted, not outside, but within, not a thought, but the absence of one. He felt no fear, no anticipation, only presence, as if the bell's stillness had become part of him. He had not touched it, and yet he understood it. It was not meant to ring by force. It rang when something reached a stillness deeper than silence, when a person stood so utterly unburdened by belief or expectation that the only thing left was resonance. He stepped back, and as he did, the chamber brightened, not with light, but with clarity. The wood grain on the walls became distinct. The air felt thinner, but not suffocating. The space no longer pressed in, but breathed outward. The bell remained quiet, but its silence had changed. It no longer waited. It remembered. As he descended the stairs, he noticed that each step now felt lighter, not from relief, but from release, as if some weight that had never belonged to him had been returned to its rightful place. Back in the sanctuary, the pews no longer seemed abandoned. They looked like places someone might sit again. Dust did not disappear, but it no longer felt like neglect, more like sediment, layers of time that had settled not in forgetfulness, but in peace. He turned, unsure of what had changed, but certain something had. And then, for a moment, he saw the outlines of others, not people, not spirits, but impressions, as if many had stood where he stood, sat where he sat, walked the same quiet arc through the same unknowable stillness. He stepped through the threshold again, back into the open frame that once held a door. The forest was waiting, not for him, but with him. The trees did not move, but they acknowledged. The air touched his face with the faintest warmth, like the breath of something just beginning to exist. The path had not changed, but it felt shorter now, more direct, less like a question. And behind him, though he did not look back, the bell did not ring. It didn't need to. Its silence had already spoken. That night, he dreamed of bells, not ringing, but swaying gently in towers with no walls. They moved in perfect silence, across landscapes he did not recognize but somehow knew. Fields of sleep, mountains of memory, rivers that flowed with names no longer spoken. He stood in each place, not as a traveler, but as someone being remembered. And in every dream, there was a sense of arrival, not to a location, but to a state of readiness, as if something had been waiting for him to notice it had already begun. When he woke, he found himself not in a bed, but on a bench beneath a tree. The forest was lighter now, morning perhaps, or just a kinder shade of dark. He didn't remember leaving the church, but there he was, outside it, with no sense of interruption. The air felt untouched, and the silence followed him, not as a shadow, but as a companion. He rose, stretched, and looked toward the path. It welcomed him, but did not lead him. It simply allowed. He began walking, not toward anything, but with something. The sound of his footsteps blended into the quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if silence was no longer the absence of sound, but a conversation being had without words. He did not check the time. There was none. There was only motion and stillness, held together by the memory of a bell that had not rung, but had changed him all the same. When he reached the edge of the forest, the town appeared as he had left it, no different, no more aware. But he knew it differently now, not with knowledge, but with recognition. the kind that lives in the back of the mind, like the scent of a place never visited, or the melody of a song never sung aloud. That night, as he lay in his bed once again surrounded by the soft hum of modern certainty, he closed his eyes and heard it. Faint, distant. A bell, not in his ears but in the space behind thought. It didn't ask him to believe. It didn't need him to remember. It only rang because he had once been willing to listen. Elsewhere, another man woke with the taste of metal in his mouth. Not blood, not iron. Something older. A tang of forgotten names and rusted belief. He sat up slowly, the sheets around him tangled as if he'd wrestled with something in his sleep. But he couldn't remember the dream, only that it had been quiet and that something in it had watched him without eyes. The room was ordinary. A desk, a shelf of unread books, the light blinking steadily from a smoke alarm. But there was a sense that something had arrived with him into morning. Not a thought, not a feeling, a suggestion. He poured his coffee and stared at it as if it might explain itself. The steam rose in spirals, drifting toward the cracked ceiling, and as he took the first sip, a sound brushed the edge of his hearing, so faint it might have been imagined. But it wasn't music, not traffic, not memory, a tone without source, and it passed so quickly he might have dismissed it, if it hadn't returned the next morning. He did not believe in signs. He had once written a thesis titled The Mythology of Coincidence in Post-Ritual Cultures, dismantling the idea that meaning was anything more than pattern recognition. He had taught it, he had debated it, he had lived by it. But now, for the third morning in a row, a sound, just a breath of a chime, no louder than a pause, drifted through the quiet of his waking, and he began to rise earlier, not to seek it, but to verify it, to prove that it wasn't there. But each time it came, it seemed less external, as if the tone wasn't heard, but remembered, and with it came images he didn't recognize, long corridors of timber and dust, a window shaped like a cross but broken at the center, shadows that didn't match the angle of the sun. He stopped reading in the evenings, stopped listening to the radio, stopped answering messages, not out of retreat, but preparation. For what? He wasn't sure. One evening, as twilight folded over the town, he stepped out without his coat, without his keys, and simply walked. The street lamps flickered as if reluctant to light the way. He didn't follow a map. He didn't take a familiar turn, yet somehow the houses grew older around him. The pavement crumbled, the sky deepened into a darker blue, not with night, but with forgetting. And when the sidewalk ended and the ground turned to gravel, he did not hesitate. He stepped onto it as if he'd always known it would be there. The trees grew thicker. The wind disappeared. The world stopped echoing. And ahead, just barely visible through the dimming hush, stood a shape he did not recognize, but had already started to remember. He approached the church without thought, his steps aligning with the rhythm of something older than footsteps. The path narrowed as he moved, not from obstruction but from intention, as if the forest had no interest in hiding him, only in refining him. Every branch overhead seemed to angle slightly inward, forming not a tunnel, but a cathedral of hesitation. The trees did not block the light. They filtered it. And what passed through was not brightness, but recognition, faint and filtered, like remembering the feeling of a place before the name. He stopped just before the open threshold. The doorway was not grand, not ornate. It had no carvings, no signs, just a frame of wood that had outlasted both purpose and weather. The interior beyond was dim, but not dark. It glowed with the kind of quiet that only belongs to rooms no longer used for their original reason. He stepped across the threshold not as a visitor, but as someone returning to a place he'd never seen. His eyes adjusted, not to the light, but to the stillness. The pews stood in rows like witnesses turned inward. There was dust, not the careless kind of neglect, but the delicate dust of undisturbed stories. Each seat held a presence as if the act of sitting had left behind a shape in the wood. He did not sit. He walked the center aisle slowly, his fingers brushing against the edge of each pew as he passed. The air felt weighted, not heavy, but thick with unsaid things. Each breath tasted faintly of ash and time. He reached the altar and paused. It was bare, just as it had been in his mind before he'd ever arrived. No symbols, no relics, just a surface shaped by reverence long since faded. Behind it, the narrow staircase waited, winding upward like a thought he hadn't quite formed. He placed his hand on the wall beside it, grounding himself, not from fear, but from anticipation, without context. He did not know what the bell would look like. He only knew it was there, and that it had called him, not as a voice, but as a silence that had become unbearable. Each step upward creaked like a sentence translated across centuries. The air grew thinner, but clearer, not fresher, just more honest. The climb was neither long nor short. It simply ended when it needed to, in a chamber shaped like the space between decisions. There was no window, yet he could see the outline of the bell through the dim. It was massive, unmoving, suspended by something unseen. It looked neither ancient nor new, just present. He stood beneath it, and this time, he waited. Not to understand, not to change, only to be exactly as he was, in the presence of something that had no interest in his story, only in his attention. He didn't know how long he stood there. Time had already begun to unfasten the moment he stepped onto the gravel path, and now it had completely unraveled. The bell above did not move, yet its stillness began to press into him, not with sound, but with shape, like a shadow forming on the inside of the chest. He felt no fear, only a widening, a soft, imperceptible crack forming in the assumptions he had built his life around. He had spent years dismantling symbols, deconstructing myths, unraveling belief systems until all that remained were systems of behavior and evolutionary logic. But now, in the quiet presence of this silent bell, those explanations seemed too brittle to hold what he was beginning to feel. It wasn't a revelation, it wasn't a breakthrough. It was simply this: something else existed, and it had never needed to be believed in to be real. The air changed, not in temperature, but in attention, as if the room had taken notice of him finally understanding that it was never about understanding. His breath slowed, not from calm, but from alignment, as though some unknown rhythm had enveloped him and all he could do was match it. The bell remained still, but in his mind, or in some place just beyond it, he heard the softest vibration. Not a tone, not a note, a moment. He stepped backward, 1 foot at a time, as if backing away from a shoreline that had shown him a glimpse of what lay beneath its still surface. When he reached the stairs again, he paused, hand resting on the rail. It felt smoother now, warmer, as if the wood itself had acknowledged him, as if it had remembered the touch of others who had stood beneath the bell and left changed in some invisible, unrecordable way. As he descended, the world below welcomed him not with light, but with steadiness. The church no longer felt like a place of waiting. It felt like a place that had completed something, and in return had nothing more to give. Not out of reluctance, out of completion. He walked the center aisle again, this time slower, not because his legs resisted, but because something in him didn't want to leave too quickly, as if a conversation had not yet finished, even though no words had ever been spoken. The pews looked different now, not physically, but perceptually, as though they were no longer merely old furniture, but memory containers, each one holding the residue of a moment someone never shared aloud. He placed his hand on the end of one bench and felt, through the wood, the outline of a long-past silence. He reached the threshold again, the frame that once held a door. The light outside had not shifted, and yet the forest beyond no longer felt like wilderness. It felt known, as if it had stepped closer in his absence. He paused at the edge of the doorway. Behind him, the church did not call him back. Ahead, the trees did not urge him forward. It was not a decision. It was a continuation, one that had started long before he was aware of it, and would go on long after. As he walked, the gravel crunched beneath his feet with a rhythm that felt familiar now. Not like footsteps, like punctuation, each step a comma in a sentence he hadn't yet finished writing. The wind returned gently, brushing against his face like an acknowledgement. The trees rustled, not with urgency, but with companionship. He was no longer being watched, he was being accompanied. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him he hadn't already carried forward. The bell would not ring for him. It didn't need to. Its silence had been enough. As he reached the edge of the forest, the town reappeared. Not altered, but somehow reframed. The shapes of buildings, the hum of distant traffic, the smell of pavement, all familiar, yet newly noticed. He stepped onto the sidewalk like someone who had never walked before, not clumsy, but conscious. And that night, as he returned to his small, cluttered apartment, the silence followed him, not oppressively, not like an echo, but like a second heartbeat, deeper, slower, quieter than his own. He resumed his routines, or tried to. The books waited where he left them. The coffee machine sputtered the same rhythm. The mirror reflected him as it always had. But something had been subtracted. Not a possession, not a trait, but an explanation. The framework of meaning he had carried for decades now held a gap shaped like a bell that never rang. He found it harder to argue. Not out loud, but inside himself. Debates once crisp now felt brittle. Certainties sounded rehearsed. He was not lost. He was loosened. The tone came back. Not at a specific hour. Not through any device. It came in the moment just before waking. A single breath of resonance. Not a message. A memory. And he realized he no longer needed to confirm it was real. Its purpose had never been evidence. It had only ever been invitation. And now he found himself listening to things he once dismissed. The creak of a floorboard, the hum of a power line, the silence between words when people spoke. All of them, suddenly, were not background. They were presence. He began walking again. Not to find the church. He knew it wouldn't appear again. Not for him. Its doors did not close, but they did not repeat. He walked to notice the tilt of a chimney, the way light angled across a leaf, the sound of shoes on different kinds of ground. It was not enlightenment, it was attentiveness, and through it, he felt the outline of something vast, not above him, not beyond, but within the quiet fabric of everything. His students noticed the change. His lectures slowed. He paused more often. He asked fewer questions. But when he did, they felt heavier, more like doors than tests. He did not speak of the church, not because he feared disbelief, but because he no longer required belief. And some truths, once experienced, retreat from explanation like deer into the woods. In the months that followed, he wrote again, but differently, not from thesis, from noticing, from the ache of unanswered music, from the shape of a silence that had once hovered above his head and still pulsed in his chest. One afternoon, as he sat on a park bench watching shadows stretch across the path, he saw someone pause. A young woman, perhaps 20, standing too still, eyes narrowed at nothing in particular. Then she moved slowly toward a tree, not remarkable in any way, and stood before it as though waiting for it to speak. He did not interrupt. He recognized the weight in her shoulders, the slight tilt of the head when something is heard but not processed, the breath held between confusion and knowing, and in that moment, he understood. The bell had never belonged to the church. It had never needed walls or steeples. It simply found places where silence had settled and waited for the right ears. The church had only been one of many, a structure built around a resonance. And when one heard it, truly heard it, they became part of its echo. Not its keeper, not its priest, just a listener who could no longer unhear. He stood, not to approach her, but to give space. Silence must never be crowded. He walked away slowly, not looking back, allowing the stillness around her to unfold uninterrupted. Behind him, the world continued. Children laughed. Birds sang. A dog barked in the distance. But through it all, he carried the soundlessness like a bell's shadow, quiet, invisible, and absolutely real. He would not speak of it again. Not because it didn't matter, but because it had already become part of everything. And for those who were meant to hear it, the silence would one day arrive. Gently, persistently, in a dream or a breath or a moment so quiet it could only be called remembering. Far from where the others had walked, in a different country entirely, a woman in her 70s sat alone in a garden overtaken by ivy. It had once been her husband's project, a geometric arrangement of stones and hedges designed with precision and intent. But he had passed nearly 2 decades ago, and now the lines were blurred. The hedges had grown wild, the stones shifted slightly by years of rain and root. And yet, she returned to it every morning, not to tend it, but to sit with it, like one might sit with a memory that has outgrown its name. She didn't speak much anymore, not because she had no one, but because words had become too small. They had carried her through children, through illness, through grief. But now, in the quiet chapter of her life, silence fit better. It held what language couldn't, what had been lost, what had been forgiven, and what remained unexplained. Each morning she brought the same chair, the same tea, and sat beneath the same overgrown archway where once there had been roses. One day, she heard a bell, faint, not from a church, not from any building nearby, just a single tone hanging in the air like the last note of a song that no one remembered starting. She looked up, but there was no wind, no bird, no movement, only the ivy, rustling slightly as if remembering something she did not. The tone did not repeat, but the next morning it returned, and again the day after that, not louder, not closer, but more familiar. She did not go searching. She had long since stopped chasing meaning, but the sound came anyway, sometimes as she poured tea, sometimes as she stepped into the kitchen, once as she stood at her husband's old tool shed with her hand on the doorknob. And slowly, her routine began to shift, not dramatically, just enough. She walked a different path through the garden. She touched the edge of the stone labyrinth he had once laid, and she began to notice things she had not seen in years, the way a vine curled around a rusted hook, the faint crack in a window pane shaped like a star, the indentation in the grass where something once sat. Then, one morning, the tone did not come, and in its absence she felt a restlessness, not panic, not longing, but a kind of unfinished listening, as if a sentence had stopped mid-thought. She walked deeper into the garden than she ever had, past the outermost hedge, past the overgrown path no one used, and there, behind a curtain of hanging moss, stood a structure she did not remember building, a small archway of stone, half-collapsed, moss-covered, utterly silent, yet utterly waiting. She stepped toward the archway slowly, as if the air around it had thickened, not with humidity or cold, but with memory, layers of it, pressed into the moss, soaked into the stone. There was no door, no inscription, just the curve of the arch, partially broken on one side, as if time had gnawed at it gently rather than shattered it outright. And yet, as she passed beneath it, she felt something soften in her spine. Not release, not burden, just readiness. Beyond it lay a hollow space she hadn't known existed. A small clearing, encircled by ivy-covered stone and broken remnants of something that may once have resembled benches or shelves or altars. But they had collapsed long ago into suggestion. Nothing here declared purpose. It simply allowed presence. She stood still for a long time, letting the silence approach her. It did not rush. It gathered, like fog does. Slow, deliberate, undeniable. She sat on the least broken of the stone forms, brushing aside damp leaves with a sleeve she didn't mind soiling. Her knees ached as they always did, but the pain seemed distant here, as though her body had not quite followed her into this space. Above her, birds did not sing, insects did not hum. It was not an absence of life, but a pause in it, a held breath between seasons. And then she heard it. Not the tone she had come to expect, but something softer. A shift, a pulse, like the creaking of a bell's brace in windless air. A sound that might not have existed at all, if not for the way it settled into her ribs. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear or age, but from something deeper. The feeling that she had arrived exactly where she was always meant to, long after she stopped needing to. She did not stand. She did not speak. She simply closed her eyes and let the stillness hold her. Behind her eyelids came the image of a church, not hers, not real, but remembered. Wooden beams darkened by time, dust floating like old prayers, a bell tower above where something large and unmoving hung between gravity and grace. She did not know this place, and yet she felt it welcome her, not with joy, not with warmth, but with recognition. And in that recognition, something loosened, an old regret, a long-held silence, a name she no longer said aloud, not gone, just given back. She opened her eyes slowly. The clearing had not changed, but she had. And somewhere in the corners of her chest, the bell that did not ring began to echo, without sound, without call, but with the weight of something deeply, intimately real. She did not speak of the archway to anyone. There was no one to tell, really, not in the way that mattered. Her daughter called once a week, her neighbor waved over the fence, the grocer made polite conversation. But none of them lived inside the kind of silence she now carried. It wasn't secrecy, it was reverence. The kind of knowing that couldn't be put into words without losing half its shape. She continued her daily walks into the garden, now with a subtle shift in intention. She brought a second cup of tea with her and left it on the moss-covered stone opposite her seat. Not in hope of a visitor, not in memory of her husband, but as an offering to the space itself. Each morning, she passed beneath the broken archway as though crossing a threshold between two dimensions of quiet. The outer world still functioned. Cars passed, birds called, the sky changed shades. But inside the clearing, all of that hushed. Even the wind seemed to tread lightly. Sometimes she would close her eyes and hear nothing at all. But it was a complete nothing. The kind that holds everything that once was and might still be. A fullness disguised as absence. She began to notice small changes. The ivy grew faster near the stone seats. A white feather always appeared in a different place each morning, sometimes on the bench, sometimes at her feet, once tucked gently into the crack of a stone. The feather was never dirty, never caught by the breeze. It simply existed, fresh and deliberate, like punctuation left by an unseen hand. And though she never picked it up, she acknowledged it with a nod. It was enough. One morning, as she sat in the clearing sipping her tea, she became aware of a sound that wasn't there. Not silence, but the outline of something missing. A moment just before resonance. Her hands rested in her lap. Her body did not move, but something in her chest leaned forward slightly, as if waiting, not expectantly, willingly. She understood then that the bell might never ring aloud, but it had already rung within her. The sound was not an event. It was a shift. A moment when life became tuned to a frequency too subtle for words but too real to dismiss. And so she stayed, long past the cooling of the tea, long past the ache of her joints, not because she waited, but because she belonged. The seasons shifted slowly. Leaves began to fall in rust-colored spirals. The air grew crisp, mornings frosted with thin veils that vanished by midday. She welcomed the change, wrapping herself in thicker scarves, pouring hotter tea, moving with slower grace through the pathways of her garden. The archway stood unchanged, untouched by frost or rot, as though time had made a quiet agreement with it to pass elsewhere. The clearing, too, remained still, neither dying nor blooming, simply steady, like the center of a turning wheel. She began to bring a small book with her, not to read, just to hold. It had belonged to her husband, notes and sketches for a chapel he had once dreamed of building. It had never come to be, not for lack of skill or resources, but because life had pulled them in different directions. Still, the book remained, and she now carried it like a memory given weight. She laid it on the stone beside the second cup, open to a random page. The drawings looked oddly familiar now: arches, bell towers, floor plans with quiet symmetry. They felt less like plans and more like recollections from places that had never been built, yet somehow had always existed. One morning, she found the book already open to a different page. She hadn't touched it. No wind had blown. But the paper had been turned, deliberately, and on the open spread was a sketch of a bell suspended in a simple wooden frame. It was unfinished, the pencil lines faint as if paused mid-thought. She smiled, not with surprise, but with understanding. Some moments arrive not as interruptions, but as answers that no longer require questions. She sat longer that day, her feet tucked beneath her shawl, the air still and respectful. The bell had not rung, not once, not with sound, not with vibration, but the sense of it had become part of her breath. Inhale, pause, exhale, resonate. She no longer needed to listen for it. It was there, in the way her heart chose a slower rhythm, in the way her hands no longer shook when she reached for the cup. The bell, she realized, was not an object. It was a state, a stillness held so completely that the world forgot to hurry. And in that forgetting, it became sacred. Later that week, she woke before the sun, not from a dream, but from an absence, the kind of waking that feels like someone stepping out of the room just before you open your eyes. The air in the house was colder than usual, the hallway darker, despite the lamp. She moved slowly, carefully, as if each floorboard might decide not to support her. Not out of weakness, but out of whim. She wrapped herself in her thickest coat, placed both cups of tea in a small basket, and carried the old book beneath her arm. The garden was silent, but not asleep. The frost glittered faintly in the pre-dawn light. Her breath trailed behind her like threads of thought not yet formed. When she passed beneath the archway, she felt something resist. Not to stop her, but to remind her that entry was never without exchange. She nodded, once, firmly, and stepped through. The clearing received her like a room that had remembered her scent. The stone seat was damp but welcoming. She placed the tea, opened the book, and waited. This time the feather was already on her lap. She did not move it. She did not need to. It lay there gently, as though placed by time itself, and she understood it was not a sign, not a message, but a seal. The moment had already been written. She sat for hours. The light changed. The frost melted. A bird called once and then stopped. She began humming, not a song she knew, but a shape her voice found in the air, soft and circular. She did not notice the bell until it was already there, not above, not behind, but within. A vibration, slow and deep, rising through the soles of her feet, into her spine, behind her eyes. It was not loud. It was not piercing. It was real. Not a sound, but a presence. And in that moment, she understood something that could not be spoken, something that would never be written, only carried. And so she sat. When the neighbor found her that afternoon, she was still seated, eyes closed, hands resting gently on the open book. There was no fear in her face, no tension, just the quiet poise of someone who had finally finished listening. The second cup of tea sat untouched, steam long vanished. The feather had slipped to the grass, the air was still. The clearing was just a garden again. They buried her quietly. Her daughter arrived 2 days later, her grief quiet but steady. She packed her mother's belongings with slow care, pausing often. When she found the sketchbook, she flipped through it absently, until she saw the bell. Her fingers hesitated. Something about the lines felt unfinished in a way that pulled at her. She closed it gently and placed it in her bag. The archway remained. No one else noticed it. Gardeners came and went, trimmed hedges, cleared paths, but none ventured past the hanging moss. It simply existed, as it always had, waiting for the moment someone might wander through by accident and stay for no reason they could name. The daughter, before leaving, sat once in her mother's chair. She poured a cup of tea. She did not understand why, but she did it anyway. And in that hour, with no one watching, no voice speaking, and no wind blowing, she felt something shift, not toward her, not away, just nearby. And though no bell rang, she tilted her head, as if she almost heard one. In a coastal town where the fog arrived more often than the sun, a boy who never believed in anything found himself unable to sleep. He was 11, too old for monsters, too young for cynicism to have fully set in. He lay awake most nights not out of fear, but out of a restlessness that clung to his skin like the salt, heavy air outside. The window in his room faced the old lighthouse on the cliffs, long since decommissioned, its light extinguished, its door chained shut. But sometimes, when the fog was thickest, he thought he saw a flicker near the top. Not a beam, just a pulse, like someone remembering how to shine. No one else mentioned it. His parents dismissed it as his imagination. His classmates talked of video games, not visions. But still, he watched. Not nightly, just on the nights when the world felt too silent, too balanced, when something needed tipping. On one such night, as fog curled against the glass like breath, he saw it again, a faint glimmer, not white, not gold, something in between, like the shimmer on the edge of a coin left in water. He rose from bed, padded quietly to the door, slipped on shoes without socks, and stepped outside without quite knowing why. The town was quiet, the streetlights blinking as if uncertain whether to continue. He walked toward the cliffs, not quickly, not cautiously, just steadily. The path wound upward, half paved, half forgotten. Grass grew between the cracks. The guardrails were rusted through, but the light was there, waiting, no brighter than before, no clearer, but now undeniable. At the base of the lighthouse, the chain that had once bound the door was gone. Not broken, not cut, gone, as if it had never existed. He hesitated, not from fear, but from awe. The kind of awe that arrives when a place you've always been told was empty suddenly breathes. He pushed the door open. It didn't creak. It didn't resist. It simply allowed. Inside, the air was warmer than expected. Dust hung motionless, catching the faintest echoes of what might have once been sunlight. The staircase spiraled upward into shadow. He began to climb. The steps were narrow, worn in the middle from feet that had long since ceased passing. Each footfall made a sound softer than the last, until eventually he moved in silence. And when he reached the top, there was no light source, no lamp, no flame, only a bell. It hung alone in the lantern room, suspended from a wooden frame darkened by time. The windows around it were too fogged to see through. But the boy did not look outward. He looked up. The bell did not move. But something in him did, as though a shape had been waiting his entire life to finally form. He reached out, not to touch, not to ring, just to acknowledge. And in that motion, the bell answered, not with sound, but with stillness so complete that it rang anyway. He stood there, hand halfway raised, not frozen, but suspended. The kind of suspension that exists not in time, but in meaning. The bell didn't shimmer or hum. It simply was, and that was enough. Around him, the room remained dim, the walls marked by streaks of salt and age. Yet the space felt alive, not in motion, but in memory. He lowered his hand slowly, not because he changed his mind, but because something inside him had shifted from question to acceptance. He sat down on the cold floor, crossing his legs the way children do when they instinctively understand a place deserves stillness. There were no benches, no cushions, nothing to suggest anyone should remain here. But he knew he wouldn't leave soon. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass in steady patterns, but it made no sound. The silence was total, but not hollow. It felt full, like the inside of a seashell held to the ear. Quiet, but with the shape of ancient thunder. He closed his eyes. Not to sleep, not to escape, just to listen. He wasn't waiting for a bell to ring. He knew now it never would. Or perhaps it already had, in the shape of his own arrival. What mattered was the listening, not for sound, but for self. And in that act, something within him softened, not broke, softened, like the sharp corners of doubt dulling under the slow erosion of wonder. He thought about the lighthouse keepers who had once climbed these stairs, maybe decades ago. Had they heard it too? Had they stood where he now sat, unsure why they felt less alone in the presence of something that had no voice? Or had the bell only existed now, for him, because he had arrived without belief, without hope, and therefore without resistance? He would never know, and that, somehow, was comforting. Minutes passed, or hours. The fog began to shift outside, a slow thinning like gauze pulling away from a wound already healed. He rose at last, not abruptly, but as if lifted. The air in the room hadn't changed, but it felt warmer now, or perhaps he had simply adjusted. He looked one last time at the bell. It hadn't moved, it hadn't aged, it hadn't rung, but it had spoken, quietly, deeply, undeniably, and he would carry its silence in the space behind his ribs for a very long time. As he descended the stairs, the walls no longer looked decayed. They looked weathered. The rusted bolts and warped wood seemed less broken and more brave. At the bottom, the door remained open behind him, and though he did not close it, he felt something settle. Not as a farewell, as a continuation. The path home would not be different, but he would be. The boy did not tell anyone, not because he was afraid they wouldn't believe him, but because he didn't need to be believed. He walked home through the quiet town as the fog receded into the sea. Streetlights blinked overhead with tired rhythm, and the sidewalks still bore the chill of the night before. But he moved through it all with a new kind of ease, like someone who had been given a name they didn't need to say aloud. At home, no one noticed the change. Breakfast was served, school was discussed, chores were assigned, and through it all, he nodded, responded, obeyed. Yet within him, the stillness remained. In class, while other students fidgeted or whispered, he stared at the rain-streaked windows and listened, not for noise, but for absence. It wasn't that he stopped hearing the world. He just started hearing through it. Beneath every scrape of a chair, every cough, every hum of electricity, there was a layer of stillness that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had always been there, simply waiting for someone to notice. And now that he had, he couldn't forget it. The silence followed him like a second shadow. He began drawing bells, not consciously. They appeared in the margins of his notebook, in the dust on the windowsill, in the condensation on his water glass. Always different, some small, some tall, some crooked, some whole, but always present. His teacher once asked him about the drawings. He only shrugged, not evasively, just peacefully. The bells didn't mean anything, not the way adults wanted things to mean. They just were. That was enough. At night, he would sit by his window and stare at the lighthouse. The light never returned, nor did the shimmer. But the building itself, silent, hollow, felt closer now, less abandoned, more like a friend who didn't need to speak to be understood. He would press his hand against the glass and let the cold seep into his skin, just enough to remind him that he hadn't imagined it. He never returned to the top. Not because he wasn't allowed, but because some places don't need to be visited twice. The bell had not asked anything of him. It had only shown itself. And that, in the strange arithmetic of quiet things, was a kind of gift. As months passed, his parents grew curious. Not worried, just watchful. He was calm now, too calm for a boy his age. He argued less, asked fewer questions, didn't seem to crave company. When spoken to, he responded. When pressed, he listened. But there was something in his gaze that made people pause. Not because it was empty, because it was full. Of something they couldn't name. One evening, as his mother folded laundry beside him, she mentioned the lighthouse, casually. A memory, perhaps. "We used to go up there," she said, before it was locked. You were very small." He didn't respond, but his hand paused over the book in his lap. She noticed, of course. Mothers always do. But she said nothing more. She folded the last towel and stood, glancing at him once. He looked back, not with guilt or fear, but with an unspoken knowing. And she left the room. Later that night she returned to the lighthouse. Alone, not because she believed anything had happened there, but because she'd remembered a feeling she couldn't quite place. The fog had rolled in again, low and thick. The air carried the scent of salt and rust. She climbed the path slowly, her boots sinking into damp earth. When she reached the tower, the door stood closed, but not locked. She hesitated, hand on the handle, feeling the weight of something just beyond the threshold. She didn't enter. She didn't need to. The moment had already passed, or arrived, or both. Instead, she stepped back and looked up. The windows of the lantern room were dark, still. Yet she felt watched, gently from inside. Not with eyes, with attention. She nodded once, barely, and turned away. That night she dreamt of bells, not ringing, not swaying, just existing, suspended in air, unmoving, but full of meaning. Elsewhere, another child, a girl with a quiet heart and too many thoughts, woke in the middle of the night, certain she had heard something impossible. A tone, faint but undeniable, had passed through her dream like a single drop falling in a well with no bottom. She sat up, staring into the dark. Her room was unchanged, her breath visible in the cold air, but something inside her had been stirred, not startled. Stirred. She rose, padded barefoot to the window, and looked out at the woods behind her house. They stood still, trees like sentinels holding secrets. The snow was soft on the branches, untouched, and the moon hung behind clouds like a question waiting for the right listener. She did not dress. She did not tell anyone. She simply stepped outside, one foot into the snow, then the next, drawn by something that had no voice. The trees accepted her without rustle. The wind held itself back. Her feet made no sound in the snow, and yet she felt accompanied, not followed, not watched, just joined. When she reached the heart of the woods, she found nothing. No light, no bell, just a single fallen tree she'd never noticed before, shaped almost like a bench, dusted with snow. Waiting, she sat. The cold bit at her, but she didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, the way one does when trying to hear a sound buried beneath silence. And there it was again. Not a bell, but the outline of one. A shape behind thought. A space behind sound. It filled her with stillness, not joy, not fear, just presence. As if the world had stopped waiting and simply was. She stayed until the snow began again. Then she stood, brushed her hands against her coatless arms, and walked home. No one woke. No one noticed. But as she slipped beneath the covers, she felt as if she had returned from somewhere older than dreams. And in her chest, something resonated. A bell that never rang, but never stopped being heard. The bells did not speak. They did not gather. They did not ring in unison across time or place. Yet somehow they were one, not connected by material, but by experience. Each one appeared in stillness. Each one called without calling. And each one left a silence in its wake that lingered longer than sound ever could. They appeared to the skeptical, the grieving, the aimless, the forgotten. Not to convince, not to comfort, but to witness. They required no belief, no offering. They arrived as reflections of something already stirring. And for those who encountered them, the world never quite returned to its former shape. It looked the same. It moved the same. But behind it, like a second horizon, there stretched a silence that held more meaning than any word. Some carried it like a secret. Others forgot it, only to remember again in their final hours. Some shared it through gestures or drawings, or music they didn't understand. But none could explain it. None could summon it. And none ever heard it twice the same way. Because the bells were never meant to change the world, only to remind it that something had always been listening. There was a man who repaired clocks for a living, wristwatches, wall clocks, once even a grandfather clock that had survived a war. His shop was narrow and deep, wedged between a florist and an empty storefront, its window always fogged from the inside. He spoke little, listened often, and touched everything with quiet hands. Time, to him, was not linear. It was layered, like dust. Some clocks he repaired out of habit. Others he disassembled just to clean, though he suspected they worked better when left slightly flawed. Precision never moved him. Resonance did. He didn't remember the first time he heard it. The sound had folded itself into the spaces between his tools, into the faint tick of a mechanism before it stopped. At first he thought it was a malfunction, a faint hum too soft to isolate. But it persisted, day after day, low and steady, just beneath thought. It never interrupted his work. If anything, it deepened his focus, as if each gear, each spring, carried a small echo of something older than hours. Then one afternoon, while adjusting the balance wheel of a broken pocket watch, he felt it shift. Not the sound, but the space around it. The room grew still, the walls softened, and a heaviness settled into his chest. Not pain, not sadness, just gravity. He stood slowly, eyes drawn not to the door, but to the farthest corner of his shop, where a shelf of clocks had remained unwound for years. Among them sat a bell he didn't remember acquiring. It was small, no taller than a teacup, cast in tarnished bronze, with no ringer inside. It shouldn't have made a sound. It shouldn't have been there. And yet, it felt utterly familiar, as though it had always waited in that spot, quietly observing him. He reached for it, not cautiously, but with the reverence reserved for objects that arrive without being placed. His fingers brushed the surface, cool and rough. The bell didn't ring, but the silence that followed throbbed with meaning, like a breath held across generations. He set it on the workbench, moved the watches aside, and sat across from it, not to test it, not to study it, but to be with it. And in that moment, surrounded by broken timepieces and faint ticking, he felt something align, not in the room, in himself. A quiet chord, struck once and left to hum in the marrow. It wasn't revelation. It was remembrance of something he'd never known, but now could not forget. He left the bell where it was. Each morning, before winding the clocks or greeting the handful of regulars who still brought in old timepieces, he would wipe the surface of the little bronze form with a cloth worn soft by decades. It did not tarnish further. It did not shine. It simply remained. At night, after the last tick had faded into quiet, he would sit across from it again, not to speak, not to listen, just to be near. The bell did not require anything of him, but in its presence he found that his thoughts slowed, not from weariness, but from a deeper kind of focus, the kind that didn't aim to understand, only to dwell. He began to notice changes in the rhythms around him. The clocks ticked differently, not irregularly, never that, but with more space between, as if time itself had grown patient. Customers lingered longer, not to chat, but to pause, to look at the old cuckoos and pendulums as though seeking something they didn't realize they'd lost. Even the street outside seemed to move quieter, fewer horns, fewer footsteps, more glances through the shop window from people who didn't come in, but slowed as they passed. He wondered sometimes if he had gone mad, but the thought didn't last long. Madness was chaotic. This was not. This was clarity by subtraction, a soft unraveling of urgency. He repaired a woman's mantel clock one afternoon, and as he placed it on the counter, she looked at him for a long time before asking, very quietly, if he had always been here. He nodded. She did not ask further. She left as though waking from a dream. That evening, the bell shifted. Not visibly, not audibly. He only knew because the space felt different, deeper somehow, as if the bell had begun ringing inward. He picked it up for the first time since that day. It was heavier than it looked, but not burdensome. He turned it in his palm and understood without explanation that the absence of a clapper was not a flaw. It was the point. The bell did not ring to be heard. It rang to be remembered. He placed it gently on the highest shelf, not to hide it, but to give it perspective. From there, it overlooked the entire room, the clocks, the customers, the dust and light. And each time he glanced at it, something in him adjusted. Not his mood, not his thoughts, his presence. As if the bell called him back to now, over and over without ever making a sound. He stopped checking the hour. The clocks still worked, still chimed when needed, but he no longer lived by them. He lived in them, in the quiet beat between ticks. And the bell, above them all, waited, not for the right time, but for the right stillness. The winter deepened, and with it, the silence in his shop seemed to grow more articulate. Snow drifted past the window in slow spirals, muffling the sounds from the street. Customers came less often now, but those who did seemed gentler, as though the snow and the stillness of the place had prepared them to move more slowly. Some brought clocks that no longer mattered, pieces that hadn't ticked in years, inherited or found in boxes left behind by people who'd gone. They didn't ask for repairs. They simply wanted to know if the thing still remembered how to move. He accepted each one quietly. Some he repaired, some he left untouched. But with each, he performed the same quiet ritual. A pause, a breath, and a glance at the bell on the shelf above. The bell remained still. It never shifted, never shimmered, but its presence now felt woven into the very arrangement of the shop, as if every gear and screw carried a tiny shadow of its silence. He began keeping the front door unlocked during hours he would have once closed. People came in during dusk or near midnight. Once, someone entered at dawn, said nothing, placed a broken travel alarm on the counter, and left. He repaired it without being asked, and when he wound it gently the next day, he swore it ticked in rhythm with something just behind his heartbeat. There were nights he slept in the back room, wrapped in wool and surrounded by half-finished restorations. He dreamed rarely, but when he did, they were never dreams of time. They were dreams of spaces, empty chapels, abandoned towers, fields of snow where nothing echoed, yet everything responded. He'd wake with the feeling that a bell had rung somewhere just out of hearing, and the calm that followed would last for days. He wrote nothing down. He told no one. But his life was becoming a kind of quiet liturgy, shaped not by belief, but by attention. The bell did not teach. It reminded. That was all. And somehow, that was everything. Then one morning it was gone. The bell. He rose from his cot in the back room, rubbed the sleep from his neck, shuffled into the front space, and the shelf was empty. Nothing disturbed, no dust displaced. Just the faint impression of weight where the bell had once rested. He did not panic. He did not check the locks or accuse the wind. He simply stood there, hand gently pressed to the wood, and understood. Its absence felt like a closing phrase, not a loss, a conclusion. The way a long-held note finally fades into air, not because it was interrupted, but because it was time. He looked around the shop. Nothing else had changed. The clocks ticked as they always had. The light fell as it always did. And yet everything felt subtly reframed, like the world had blinked just once. He returned to his bench and resumed work on a mantel clock with a chipped face. His hands moved as before, but inside him there was a stillness more complete than any silence he'd ever known. The bell had not departed. It had arrived somewhere else. That much he could feel. It had never belonged to him. He had only held its presence for a while. From that day forward, he no longer took payments. People brought him their clocks, and he repaired them. Or he didn't. Sometimes he simply handed them back, unchanged, with a nod. Those who received them never questioned the gesture. They left with a kind of softness in their expression, as if they, too, had heard something in the space between ticks. His own watch remained unwound. He no longer wore it. The bell's silence now lived in him directly. Elsewhere, in a town by the hills, a woman found an old church key beneath the floorboards of her childhood home. The house was being cleared, its contents parceled into boxes of keep, donate, and uncertain. The key had no tag, no markings, just the weight of purpose long since disconnected from context. She turned it in her fingers for hours before deciding not to discard it. Instead, she kept it in her coat pocket, touching it absently throughout the day, like a talisman she had forgotten to name. Days passed. Then weeks. One evening, walking home in the snow, she took a different turn, not on purpose, not with plan. And at the end of that unfamiliar road stood a building she didn't know, but which felt immediately known. The stone was weathered, the steeple slanted, and the door. The door had a lock shaped precisely for a key like the one she carried. She paused at the threshold, not in doubt, in acknowledgement. Then she inserted the key. It turned without resistance. Inside was dust, pews, emptiness. But more than that, space that listened. She walked the aisle slowly, her footsteps not echoing, only continuing. At the front stood a platform where an altar might have been. There was no cross, no iconography, only a place shaped by attention. She stood before it, hands still in her coat pockets, and for a moment forgot why she had come. Then she heard it. Not a chime, not a toll. A presence, the kind of presence that fills a room without entering. Her breath caught, not from fear, from fullness. She closed her eyes, and behind the lids, something vast and quiet moved. She had not prayed in years. She did not start now. She simply remained. And the bell that no longer existed anywhere was already there. Across countless places, across rooms both sacred and discarded, across paths forgotten by maps and moments forgotten by memory, the bells continued, not ringing, being, each one arriving only once, each one leaving no proof, no doctrine, no trace but silence. They did not ask for belief. They did not require invitation. They chose no creed, no origin. They existed in the breath before understanding, in the gaze that lingers too long on an empty field, in the stillness between heartbeat and thought. And to those who met them, not by pursuit but by pause, they gave something quieter than wisdom, a resonance, a tuning. Not all who heard them knew. Not all who knew remembered. But for some, the bell never left. It became the way they walked, the way they waited, the way they listened when no one else did. And when they too were gone, the silence remained, not to fill the space, but to hold the shape of someone who once heard what others could not. There was a room at the back of an old university library that no one ever seemed to need. It wasn't hidden exactly, just never found. Its door bore no sign, and the hallway that led to it had a way of slipping past memory, like a dream retold too many times. The custodians did not clean it. The catalogs did not list it. And yet, the key remained in the head librarian's drawer, though she no longer remembered why. Once a year, she would unlock it, stand in the threshold, glance at the dustless floor, and quietly close it again. She never entered. One winter, a graduate student wandered in by accident. He wasn't searching for it. He had simply been tracing a footnote through 3 references and 2 forgotten stacks, until suddenly he was standing before the door. He paused, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it felt exactly as it should, as if some part of him had always known he would find it, just not when. He tried the handle. It turned smoothly. Inside, the room was unremarkable. A table, a chair, a single unlit lamp. Bookshelves lined the walls but held no books. The air had no dust, no scent, but carried a weight like unspoken questions. He stepped in slowly. The door clicked shut behind him, not with malice, but with certainty. He didn't turn to check it. The light from the hallway had been enough, and now the darkness was not deep, just deliberate. He stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to look for, and that's when he noticed the bell. It sat on the center of the table, small, dark, perfectly still. There was no clapper inside. He leaned in, not to examine it, but to acknowledge it. Its shape was unadorned, yet precise, the kind of precision that suggested it had not been made, but remembered. The kind of shape that arrived when someone needed it, long before they knew why. He did not reach for it. He did not move closer. Instead, he sat in the chair and folded his hands. The bell did nothing. It simply was, and so was he. Minutes passed. Or hours. The room made no demands. His thoughts quieted, not cleared, just stepped aside. And in their place, something older arrived. Not a memory, not an idea, a presence. As though the silence itself had turned its attention toward him. And in that gaze, he found a stillness he had never known, one that asked nothing, explained nothing, promised nothing. It simply held him, gently and completely. And as he sat there, breathing in that steady quiet, he understood that the bell would not ring. It already had. In the days that followed, he returned to the room often, never by intention, only when the day slipped sideways, when time lost its sharpness and the corridors stretched too long. He would turn a corner expecting a staircase and find the door instead. Always closed, never locked. And always the room unchanged. The bell sat where it always had, waiting without expectation, silent in the way that makes silence feel like an answer. He began to bring things with him, not offerings, just objects that carried the residue of thought. Scrap paper filled with equations he no longer believed in, a broken compass from his childhood, a feather from a crow he'd found dead on the steps of the faculty building. He placed them on the table beside the bell, not to decorate, not to question, but to witness. Over time, they formed a quiet circle around the bell, each item untouched by dust, by decay, by explanation. He stopped telling others where he went. When they asked, he deflected, not out of secrecy, but because there was nothing to explain. The bell was not a destination. It was a pause in everything else. It became the breath between his obligations, the space where he remembered how to sit without needing to arrive. His thesis advisor noticed the shift in his writing, more spacious, less certain, more aware of what could not be solved. One evening, after a long day of failed thoughts and unopened books, he found himself in the room again. The lamp remained unlit, the objects untouched, the air still, but something felt different. He sat, as he always did, and closed his eyes, letting the silence press gently against him. And then he heard it. Not a ring, not a chime, but a recognition. As if the room had exhaled for the first time. He opened his eyes and found the bell in the same place, but something about its presence had deepened, the way a shadow deepens at dusk, not by moving, but by settling. He reached toward it, not to take, but to steady himself. His fingers hovered above the curve of metal, and in that suspended breath, something inside him unlocked. A memory he'd never lived, a name he'd never spoken, a question that had never needed words. He did not touch the bell. He did not need to. The moment had already passed, or perhaps had just arrived. When he left the room, he closed the door softly behind him. For the first time, he forgot to mark the path back, and somehow that felt right. Time passed. The student graduated. The university remained. The room, if it still existed, faded from the building's blueprints. New shelves were installed where old corridors had once turned. The faculty changed. The key vanished from the drawer, but somewhere in the quiet of the architecture, the memory of the bell persisted. Not as rumor, not as myth, but as stillness left behind like scent. Some nights, the janitor paused outside a stretch of wall with no door and felt watched. Not unpleasantly, not insistently, just gently. The student moved to another city. He took a position at a museum, cataloging fragments from eras that had long since silenced themselves. Clay figures, shattered vessels, coins with worn faces. His days were filled with quiet preservation, his nights with tea and the slow unraveling of what he once thought knowledge meant. He no longer looked for meaning in patterns. He waited for presence. Sometimes, while handling a relic, an amulet, a ceremonial bell, a carved bone, he would pause, not because of its age or artistry, but because something about it echoed. Not memory, not déjà vu. Something like agreement, as though the object, long buried, recognized the silence he carried. No one else seemed to notice. But he knew when it happened. It was always the same, a soft fullness in his chest, a steadiness in his fingers, the sense that something invisible had just nodded. He kept a notebook, but it was mostly blank. Only one sentence appeared, rewritten dozens of times in different places. The bell does not ring to be heard. Each time he wrote it, it felt new. Each time he read it, it felt older. He began to smile more, but spoke less. He answered questions with questions. He held eye contact a little longer than people expected, but no one found it uncomfortable. They just left his presence with a strange calm, like they'd forgotten something heavy in his office and were relieved not to carry it home. He never sought the room again. He didn't need to. It had never been a place, not really. It had been a moment, extended, repeated, embedded, and it still moved through him like breath. Somewhere far from cities, beyond the reach of roads, an old chapel stood in the middle of a valley no map named. Its stones had cracked from frost and sun. Its roof sagged from years of unaddressed collapse. But within its walls, the air remained untouched. Moss grew in patterns that echoed brushstrokes. Ferns reached toward gaps in the stone as if drawn by something other than light. Inside, the altar had long since fallen. The floor was uneven with age. But in the back, where a small wooden bell frame still clung to the arch above the entry, something waited. There was no bell now. Perhaps there never had been. But travelers who stumbled into the valley on rare, directionless hikes spoke of a hush that fell over them upon entering. Not fear, not reverence. Something in between. A man once camped nearby and awoke at dawn with the feeling that he had missed something. Not an animal, not a sound, a presence. He rose, walked into the chapel barefoot, and stood still for a very long time. When he left, he never told anyone. He moved to a smaller town, left his job, and began carving small wooden objects with no purpose. He gave them away freely. They sat on mantels, on windowsills, in the pockets of those who received them. None of them knew why they kept them, only that they couldn't throw them out. In another season, a woman passed through the same valley. She had been walking for days with no goal. Her map had fallen apart. Her phone had died. She found the chapel not by choice, but by exhaustion. When she stepped inside, she cried, not because she was sad, because the silence wrapped around her like recognition. She stayed for only an hour, but later, when her life resumed, she spoke slower, touched things more deliberately, and began humming songs with no melody. No one spoke of the chapel often. It did not appear in guidebooks. The few who knew of it never remembered the name of the valley, even when they tried. But sometimes, on nights when the wind was too still and the fire too low, someone would remember walking inside. And for a breathless moment, they would almost hear it. Not the ring of a bell, but the absence where a bell should have been, and the peace that followed. In the final years of a long life, a woman sat each morning beside her window, watching the same tree lose and regain its leaves. Her hands trembled now, her voice no longer carried, but her eyes remained clear. On her bedside table sat a small ceramic sculpture, simple, dome-shaped, with a hollow in the center. Visitors often asked about it. She never answered. She simply touched it, very lightly, as if to reassure it that she too still remembered. Once her nurse found her awake before dawn, smiling softly at nothing. When asked if she needed anything, she only shook her head. The nurse left the room and paused in the hallway, unsure why her chest felt suddenly full. Not heavy, not aching, just full, like something deeply important had just passed between them, silent, invisible, permanent. In her final week, the woman spoke only once. Her daughter, seated by her side, had taken her hand and whispered a lullaby she used to hum when she was small. The woman, eyes closed, smiled and said, barely audible, "It rang for me." Nothing more. No one understood. No one asked. But when she passed, the room felt unusually still. The air did not move. The light through the curtains did not flicker. It was as though the space itself had held its breath, and then let it out, very slowly. Later, the daughter kept the ceramic piece. She didn't know what it was, but she placed it on her bookshelf and found herself glancing at it each time life became too fast. She never touched it, only looked. And in those brief pauses, the world always seemed to shift just slightly, just enough. Somewhere still the bells exist, not in towers, not in rooms, not in stone or bronze. They exist in the moment a child stops mid-play and looks toward nothing with wide eyes, in the second before a tear falls, when memory returns uninvited, in the hush that fills a room after someone important has left, not the door, but the world. They exist in every breath where something once explained becomes simply felt, in every corner where silence does not echo, but listens. No one can summon them. No one can claim them. They come only when belief has been folded away, when attention is wide and wonder is unguarded. They do not speak, but they are heard. They do not call, but they are followed. They do not stay, but they never entirely leave. They mark no hour, they toll no grief, they summon no prayer, and yet they remain, for those who once heard them, in dreams, in stillness, in absence. They will never be unheard.